Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk for Cybersecurity Awareness Month at the Nasdaq market site is Mark Ferrari, CEO of Latitude Information Security, Sara Sendek, Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Data Privacy at FTI Consulting, and Cameron Dicker, Director of Global Business Resilience at FS-ISAC. We're here to discuss the evolving cyber threat environment, crypto agility integration, and why cyber awareness takes many forms in today's environment. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks, and let's go around the horn here quickly just with an update on what your business is, where you fit within the cybersecurity space, Mark.
So I'm with Latitude Information Security. We are a global or a nationwide cybersecurity consultancy and a high trust assessor. We're veteran owned and focused primarily in pharmaceutical and healthcare.
Yeah, and Cameron, tell us about FS-ISAC, a couple acronyms there.
Yeah, FS-ISAC stands for the Financial Services Sector Coordinating, the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center. We are a global organization that does cybersecurity and resilience for the financial sector. We are a member-based organization in 75 countries.
And Sara, the work you're doing at FTI Consulting.
Yeah, I'm with FTI Consulting. I'm on our cybersecurity and data privacy communications team. We advise clients across all industries and sectors on incident response and preparedness for cyber incidents, whether it be ransomware, nation-state actors, APT, insider threat, and that sort of thing. Just help them manage their communications response with stakeholders and everything else.
So let's talk about the current threat environment. What's the most impactful events that are happening, whether it's ransomware, or, whether it's integrating of all these new emerging technologies into enterprise and so forth? What's keeping CISOs and the security organization up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I think ransomware is still one of the most prominent cyber crimes we're seeing out there, cyber threats we're seeing out there. Law enforcement action earlier this year took down some of the major actors like Lockbit that were responsible for some of the biggest cyber attacks that we've seen. So we have seen these groups kind of disband a little bit or take a lower profile. Unfortunately, they're still wreaking havoc on particularly the healthcare sector. Hospitals, we're still seeing a lot. We've seen major attacks like Change Healthcare going on. And then in addition, we're also watching a lot of these threats from nation-state actors. FBI has been warning about nation-states targeting critical infrastructure. China perhaps trying to wreak havoc on that. So helping the private sector understand where those threat vectors are and what they need to do to be ready to respond.
Yeah, I would imagine financial services as well as a hotspot for cyber risk.
Yes, and we're seeing a lot of ransomware. It is one of our top threats. However, the risk that we're seeing most prominently now is third-party risk as financial services continue to outsource the services that they provide their customers to large third-party tech companies.
Yeah, and Mark, you make a great point in your notes here that cybersecurity awareness takes many forms.
It does. So number one, everyone within an organization needs to play their part in cybersecurity. So they have to be aware that number one, they're in an environment that is under attack and they may be the means by which that attack is successful. But it goes all the way through the organization. Technology leaders, IT leaders need to have an understanding. They need to be aware of what's in their environment. They need to know what risks they're getting or inheriting from their third parties. The Change Healthcare in healthcare was a tremendous example of that. And then as we get higher and higher into boards of directors or senior leadership, they need to be aware that the question is not how do you make us secure? The question is how do we reduce our vulnerability with the resources we have or the resources we can get? Because security is a concept that is always going to be chased. Right,
so it's not like, Cameron, you just implement a strategy and walk away from it. And you have to adapt to this environment because of all these new technologies. It's evolving quicker, and to Sara's point, these threat actors are perhaps sometimes nation states, and they're very well funded, and they're leveraging the same tools that the good actors are.
Correct. I like to think of it as shifting risk rather than reducing risk. As you move to a more secure system by outsourcing your services, you reduce your risk on a physical location by, say, going to the cloud. However, the cloud has its own risks associated with it and its own vulnerabilities. So now you're managing those risks at the sort of shift away from your physical risks. So it's about understanding your risk landscape and then putting in place strategies that buy down that risk and constantly reassessing your risk.
Yeah, and that's a good point that Cameron brings up, Sara. Think about it in the context of the past 5 to 6 years with everybody migrating over to the cloud to remain competitive. thrown a pandemic where we were thrown into hybrid work, right? That's another vulnerability. Then you have generative AI and this rush to implement these new, well, not that AI is new, but bringing Gen AI on board. It's part of the consumer vernacular. Everybody wants to play with it, inside the org and outside. That also can lead to data privacy and governance issues as well, because more technology begets more data.
Correct, correct. And that's something that we've seen be a major issue for any organization that's a victim of a cyber attack, especially ransomware, when they have data privacy consequences. Ransomware actors, cyber criminals, are known for trying to exfil data and use that as a form of demanding payment. And then once that, even if that's not leaked on the dark web, once they have it, once they've accessed it, there's an entire series of steps, legal notifications that any organization needs to take, and then kind of answer for what they've done to protect that data, how they've been safeguarding it in the past, and how they're going to further safeguard it in the future.
Yeah, well, and that's another challenge, Mark, being able to respond to
Exactly.
the regulators.
Exactly. And whenever we speak security, I always feel like the doom and gloom person, because the threats out there are just getting worse and worse. What's the good news? What can you control? You can control how you respond to an incident. And you have to approach that with the mindset that you will have to. Information security, cybersecurity typically lives in the IT department more often than not. It should live within the organization across all verticals. And it is imperative that organizations practice their incident response with communications, more so than anyone, with information technology, with physical security, with leadership, with legal, with compliance. They all need to be in that room for the tabletop exercise or for the discussion about how are we going to go about this, so that they all know immediately who to call, because when an incident happens, as we all know, it happens very fast and word can get out very fast, so you need to stay ahead of that.
So Cameron, it's like doing a fire drill.
Yes.
On a regular basis. So, how are you working with financial services companies and helping them design their cyber and operational risk strategies?
Yeah. We do probably about 30 exercises a year with our members globally. And I always like to start by telling our members, we're in the business of trust. The incident response process you create has to instill trust in the public and in the customers. You're not really in the business of money, you're in the business of trust. And once you lose that trust, people will move their assets elsewhere. So your plan has to involve IT, business, comms, and legal, so that whatever you say and whatever you do instills trust. And then you have to practice it until you can do it in your sleep.
Yeah, well, you also want the messaging to be consistent as well, because it does create some confusion. What's the response time? 4 days, I believe, when you're reporting it to regulators, and that's a time crunch. You're trying to, figure out where the bodies lay, if you will, right? And be able to effectively communicate that through the organization, then also to your clients, your partners, and all your other vendors too, because to your point, third-party risk, Sarah, that's a key theme I've been hearing throughout Cybersecurity Awareness Month this October of 2024 is third-party and vendor risk.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that as of late, a lot of these major supply chain attacks that end up not directly affecting an organization, but affecting them through third-party risk, and they're still responsible at the end of the day for communicating that out, for whatever data is exposed, for whatever regulatory obligations, notification obligations they need to make. And so they still have this responsibility of what kind of level of security awareness did they do ahead of time, what level have they checked to make sure that these vendors are safe, and making sure that the data obviously is safe at the end of the day.
And we've also seen with some of these major incidents and breaches that it could take down, it affects especially healthcare.
Correct.
That was
correct. It has wide-ranging impacts,
Right.
and doesn't just affect the Change Healthcare. It affects the physicians, the patients all over the country.
Right.
And we saw that.
Yeah, and if I could jump on, you mentioned the fact, you mentioned trust as a concept and talking about third-party risk. As an organization, if you have a third party that experiences an incident, you need to start to respond to that yourself to determine, do I need to isolate? What happened there? Is it possibly going to translate over to my organization? And in that, those relationships with the third parties are incredibly important, because if they're behind a black box and they're not telling you what's going on or what their indicators of compromise are, what risk you might experience, it's very difficult to continue that trust. Where I've seen it both ways, where it's little information versus as much information and they're forthcoming. And trust me, the outcomes are so much better when the information is shared as kind of peers to prevent any propagation of an incident.
And just building on that, what we've seen in the financial sector is, while all of these companies are competitors, they're also clients of each other.
Yeah.
So they have sort of a vested interest in all of them surviving. So they view at least cybersecurity and resilience as a team sport, even if on the business side they are competitive. So they share, and they share often. And it's, I think, made for a much more secure financial sector.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're also a consortium to advance their priorities as well from a market structure and policy perspective. So I'm glad you brought that up, that they're not necessarily competitors as you would think in the traditional sense. I keep hearing about quantum computing and financial services and the vulnerabilities that are there. Tell us more about that.
So as I mentioned, financial services is built on trust. And part of that trust is that we can keep your data secure. With post-quantum computing, it could be possible, not yet, but could be possible that an adversary can break the algorithms that secure the financial data, possibly exposing your account information or even manipulating trade data before it happens, changing payment data. This would undermine the integrity of the sector. So this is a huge concern for us. And it gets complicated when you need to be able to have an algorithm that communicates across a large number of financial firms in an ecosystem. So it can't be that one firm solves this problem and is fine, and they're just a castle. They have to then be able to communicate that secure data to everyone else securely.
Well, I mean, that's a global capital markets issue if you have trade data vulnerabilities such as what you just described. I mean, that's not specific to just one company within the financial services sector. Sara, are kind of a rudimentary question, are we winning? Are the bad actors getting away with more, or do we just not hear about, the good things that the good actors are doing, or is it a balance of the two?
I mean, I said this at the start. Law enforcement and government has been taking a lot more proactive action, and we've seen the effects of that. After they took down major ransomware groups like Hive and Lockbit, they've kind of gone into hiding a little bit, are a little afraid. But I think at the end of the day, cybercrime, these cyber threats are always going to be there. When we talk about the cyber risk, it's if not when are you going to be attacked. And so I think what's important, what would help us be winning, is to have more awareness, companies understanding that this is not just the IT department, as we talked about. This is a whole organization from the board to CEO on down. Everyone needs to be involved and ready and have a plan and be prepared.
Well, it has to be ingrained within the culture.
It is, yeah, and culture is paramount, and it's the hardest thing to change. I started my career in the military that has a mindset of security 24/7. But you know that in the military you're dealing in an adversarial business. That's the culture. Unfortunately now private industry, government, education, any sector is also consistently under attack, and that's a very different shift from what we normally experience. So understanding that you very well might become a victim of an attack. And so let's prepare for that. How do we tighten up our incident response? And I think incident response is really where the good stories are found. Security is one of those industries where you don't hear about the victories because they go unnoticed.
Yeah.
But culture from the top down, it's the only way, because you have to instill process, procedure, in addition to people and technology to focus on it. And the process and procedure that secures things, secures practices, permeates the organization, whether those carrying it out know it or not. There's security built into it. So you need security to be a priority from the top, and you need to be open in communicating as to its importance and the role people play. I think they're more than happy to help play that role, but they need to understand it and they need to be armed with how to respond.
Cameron, how does the CISO or the security function effectively communicate this to the board, to senior leadership, to get the resources that they need and make sure that it's not siloed and they have a bird's eye view of being able to assess this risk and respond to it?
So I think there's never one time where this communication has to happen. The CISO needs to be working with the board on a regular basis so that they understand the risk they are taking on by the decisions they make. These decisions are not solely cyber decisions. They are business decisions, and they need to be assessed as business risk so that when it comes time to ask for 10 more people or a new platform, the board understands why that's necessary and what benefit that has the company.
Yeah. You know, it's almost like when you think about the compliance function, you never want to hear from compliance, but at the end of the day, these are the teams that allow the organization to operate and derive revenue and, you know, advance the company forward. Without the cyber team, the compliance teams, the risk management teams, the company doesn't exist.
Yeah, and to Cameron's point, you know, with the new SEC rules that have taken place, CISOs are responsible for communicating to the board the risk. At FTI, we've actually done surveys of CISOs that feel they're unprepared or feel that they may need to kind of hide these risks or make things sound better to the board than they are. And so, you know, part of the future of cybersecurity is empowering these CISOs. They're now playing elevated positions in their organization to have to communicate these cybersecurity risks to the board. But there's also a responsibility of the board to understand what those risks are and make those investments and be ready and understand that those risks can have serious consequences moving forward.
I think it's an encouraging thing that you're starting to see more cyber representation on boards as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Because it is a different language that, you know, you're speaking to the board senior leadership, to the CFO, who might have, you know, a better understanding of risk management. There's a number of hats, to your point, that they have to wear and be able to communicate that, and that's different for every audience.
Yeah, and that was one of the initial thoughts that the SEC was going to implement as one of the rules, was to require that boards have some sort of cyber representation. They didn't end up doing that, but I think we'll see that be more expected moving forward.
Yeah.
Just an expectation, and ideally organizations can take that responsibility on themselves instead of being regulated by the SEC to do so.
Mark, if you read between the lines here and you think about sectors like healthcare and financial services and the global capital markets, is this, can we also correlate this to a bigger national security issue in response?
In terms of that, I mean, security, no matter what the prescriptive body is, you know, whether it's NIST or HITRUST or ISO, there is a set of standards out there. And so organizations can pick and choose and use that as a framework. Ultimately, is there a one-size-fits-all? Not really, but in the end, nobody's dreaming up new security controls, right? By and large, they're ubiquitous. If you are managing access properly, if you're limiting your exposure to the web properly, and I could go down the line. But it all goes down to an overall adoption. It goes back to culture, to be honest. You mentioned the board. The board has to have that proper understanding of, we're not going to hear good news from the CISO. We shouldn't hear good news from the CISO at times. You know, yes, all the things we've done to lower risk or to shift risk, but ultimately, these are our holes. Do you accept them or not? And that's the key. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's a good point that you bring up, because there's small, medium size, large businesses. Risk appetite is different for every type of business. Every sector, as you know, financial services is regulated in different ways. There has to be flexibility in terms of the solutions as it relates to the sector, size of the company, risk appetite.
Yeah, and you're always going to be vulnerable to something. So it's not about driving your risk to zero. It's about driving your risk to a point where you're comfortable with the risk you've chosen to take on. And doing that requires being informed. So you need to be talking to your CISO and understand they're going to give you bad news more often than not. And your job isn't to eliminate all of the problems, it's to eliminate the ones you can, make sure you've covered the basics, and then have a strategy for how you're going to respond if the risks you've chosen to take on do turn into an incident.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's a smart strategy. I mean, you know, having served in the military, thank you for your service, by the way, but also being in the cybersecurity space, you think about risk first.
Yeah.
That's how you approach.
It is, and it's really out of necessity, right? Because organizations have limited resources, and how do they most effectively manage that? Apply them to the greatest risks and move on down, right? Because you can't, as you say, get to a zero risk position. But yeah, you have to go in with the mindset. I think inherently information technology does this, healthcare does this to an extent, but they always look at the what if, right? So yes, we have endpoint protection. Well, what if that's bypassed, or what if it's not put on a machine, or what if that machine doesn't get updated? So you know, people that are in the professionals that are in the cybersecurity space kind of do have that, and I'll say it again, that doom and gloom kind of mentality, because they do have to think of what is not normally being thought of. They have to think, what if this gets defeated? And you know, to go to kind of the tenets of cybersecurity. What you want to achieve is defense in depth. You want to assume that a control may fail. You want to assume that someone may skip a step or take a shortcut. And then if that happens, do we have compensating controls that mitigate that risk? And so you're trying to create a very complex interlocked web of controls that, should one fail, there are many others that will hopefully prevent something catastrophic.
And Sarah, final thoughts here?
Yeah, I would just agree and say it's a lot about understanding the risk and then building the resiliency into your plan. Knowing, assuming that things will fail, things will go wrong, who's going to be in the room, who do you need, how are you going to respond? Because how you respond makes the difference between a catastrophic event and just a regular cyber event.
All right, appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.